Hello learners. In this video, we are going to study the influence of culture on self and identity development. This topic is a part of BPCG 175 Psychology of Living, Unit 1 Self and Identity Development. So what are we going to study in this video? Firstly, we are trying to understand the concepts of self and identity. We will also understand the concept of culture. And then we will try to explain how cultures differ and shape different kinds of selves. All of this will help us to understand ourselves better in the context of the cultural surroundings in which we are living. So let's begin. What is self? Self is the I, which reflects or experiences feelings, thoughts, needs, ideas, and so on. Who is the I? I is the knower. Self also includes the me, which is the object of the reflection or experience, which means the known. The thoughts, needs, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, values that we have constitute the me. This me is changing from moment to moment as the situation changes. For example, when we succeed, don't we feel that we are competent? And when we fail, don't we feel that we are incompetent? At times, we want stimulation. We want excitement. But at times, we need peace and quiet. So, the I is the one that reflects on all of these changing aspects of the me. Self is the continually developing sense of awareness and agency that guides action and takes shape as the individual becomes attuned to the various environments it inhabits. What is culture? Culture means several things. It is almost the air that we breathe. Definitionally, culture is a historically determined set of denotative, which means what is, normative, which means what should be, and pragmatic, which means how to do, knowledge shared by a group of individuals who participate in a form of social structure. This is a definition given by Triandis in 1995. In short, it refers to shared knowledge, meaning, and practices of a society. Let us try to understand culture using an example. A cultural norm. We all have cultural norms, and one of which is the gender division of role. For example, women do the household chores and men work in the public world, and the related status differential. That is, women do less important work than men. This practice is based on certain ideas, beliefs, rules, and norms about men and women and their position in the world, which are held in common by people of a particular society. This shared aspect is culture. The fact that people believe in this is what makes it a cultural norm. People in different cultures may have different cultural ideas, beliefs, and norms about gender roles and relations. In agrarian culture, for example, women have always worked outside homes, on farms, and have contributed to various other kinds of farming-related economic activities. Thus, cultural meanings about gender roles and status hierarchies are not the same in all societies. Let us now move to understanding how do culture and self relate with each other. how does self and culture shape each other? They do so through mutual constitution. Big word, isn't it? Let us try to simplify this. People and their social cultural environments are not separate. Both of them influence each other. People's selves are shaped by the socio-cultural context through socialization influences. A self requires inputs from socio-cultural meanings and practices. The self is the center of awareness and agency and incorporates and reflects these patterns. In turn, people's thoughts, feelings and actions, which constitute our self, reinforce or change the socio-cultural meanings and practices that shape their lives. In a sense, what we have to understand is that the social cultural environment shapes us, but that doesn't mean that as individual selves we are passive recipients of these influences. We also have the agency to shape, to negotiate and to change these social and cultural meanings and practices. Let us understand this with the help of an example. It is a culturally accepted norm that women are primary caretakers of children, especially newborns and young children. Women internalize this message and become psychologically ready to mother children exclusively during the infancy stage. At best, she may be assisted by other women in the family. However, men are usually exempted from the care responsibilities of infants. In this way, culture shapes the gendered self of men and women. How? One way is that by following the cultural norms. This leads to perpetuation of cultural values and norms. However, it is the way cultural norms are resisted and changed by individuals' personal goals, needs and feelings that give us a clearer idea of the influence that self exerts on the cultural system. In an incident of the year 2020, Indian cricket captain Virat Kohli took paternity leave and left the Australian tour after one match to be available with his wife during the childbirth and the period after. This action by a celebrated role model flagged the need for fathers to be emotionally available for their infant children and wives and made paternity leave more acceptable at workplaces. So, doesn't this example tell us that we are not passive recipients of cultural and social influences? We don't have to always act by what the cultural norms are, but we can also negotiate, resist and change them. Doesn't that make us feel empowered? Okay, now we move on to conceptualization of culture. This discussion will help us to understand better what is culture in more detail. Culture has been conceptualized in terms of different dimensions which are linked with various aspects of psychological functioning. Let us become familiar with two most well-known conceptualizations of culture in psychology. The first is the dimensions of culture given by Hofstede. Hofstede in 1980 has identified 6 cultural dimensions along which cultures vary. Let us try to understand each one of them one by one. First, high versus low power distance. This is a dimension where cultures vary on power distance. In cultures high on power distance, less powerful members of institutions like family and organizations like schools, corporate, political parties accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Thus, the legitimacy of hierarchy, which is based on power, age and gender and authority, is largely unquestioned. whereas the cultures which are low on power distance have flatter hierarchies. Obedience and control are minimum in social relationships between young and old, superior and subordinate, student and teachers. Second, high versus low uncertainty avoidance. Cultures which are high on uncertainty avoidance have lower tolerance for ambiguity. In such cultures, strict behavioral codes and rules are sought, deviant opinions are deemed as dangerous, and they are curbed, and absolute truths are sought after. Cultures which are low on uncertainty avoidance are more accepting of ambiguity, and they are also more tolerant of differences. The third dimension that Hofstede talks about is the very well-known individualism versus collectivism dimension. In the individualistic cultures, ties amongst individuals are loose. Everyone looks after oneself and maximally one's immediate family. Personal opinion and expression is welcome. But in collective cultures, people are integrated into strong, cohesive groups, which include extended family, caste, regional, religious groupings. Interdependence, loyalty, and harmony amongst in-group members is privileged. Personal opinion and expression are de-emphasized in collectivist cultures. Fourth is masculinity versus femininity. Cultures high on masculinity prescribes different social and emotional roles for men and women. For example, boys should not cry while girls can. Boys should fight back while girls should not. Cultures which are high on femininity, on the other hand, de-emphasizes the gender division of labor. Men and women both are expected to participate in care-related responsibilities. There is sympathy for weak and greater participation of women in positions of power. The fifth dimension is the long-term versus short-term orientation. Cultures which are high on long-term orientation see the world as dynamic, they are future-oriented, they believe in adaptation to changing situations, and they try to learn from examples of other countries. They consider thrift and perseverance as important goals. On the other hand, cultures which are high on short-term orientation may consider present as more important than future, may treat traditions as sacrosanct, and immediate gratification is incentivized. The sixth and the last dimension that Geets has spoken about is indulgence versus restraint. Cultures which are high on indulgence allows for free gratification of human needs and desires. Enjoyment, leisure, and pleasure are given free rein, whereas the cultures which are high on restraint controls gratification of needs and regulates it by social norms. There is low perception of personal control, and leisure and pleasure are not highly worthwhile social aims. We now move on to the second conceptualization of culture given by Harry Triandis, a very well-known social psychologist. He has talked about cultural syndromes. According to Triandis, a cultural syndrome is a pattern of shared attitudes, beliefs, categorizations, self-definitions, norms, role definitions, and values that is organized around a theme that can be identified amongst those who speak a particular language during a specific historic period and in a definable geographical region. Triandis in 1994 identified 4 cultural syndromes. The first is cultural complexity. For example, the hunter-gatherer society are simpler as compared to service and the information societies of contemporary times. The former had fewer lifestyle options and choices such as career options, social roles, and values. The second is tight versus loose culture. A tight culture is one where there are rules for many situations and they are applied strictly. Minor deviations from the rules are punished. Tighter societies have more interdependency, greater surveillance over people. A loose culture is where there are fewer rules and norms of social behavior. There is also greater tolerance for deviations from norms. It is more heterogeneous and people don't depend on each other so much. The third cultural syndrome that Harry Triandis talks about is individualism versus collectivism. Individualistic and collectivist cultures can be horizontal, which emphasizes equality, or vertical, which emphasizes hierarchy. The way these emphases intersect with individualism and collectivism produce four distinct patterns: horizontal individualism, horizontal collectivism, vertical individualism, and vertical collectivism. So in this way, Harry Triandis has worked further on the dimension of individualism and collectivism given by Hofstede. Now let us look at each one of these four possibilities a little more closely. In horizontal individualism, people want to be unique and self-reliant without being especially interested in gaining status and power. In vertical individualism, people want to acquire status and be the best, and they do this in individual competition from each other. In horizontal collectivism, people see themselves as being similar to others and emphasize common goals with others as well as interdependence, but they do not easily submit to authority. In vertical collectivism, people emphasize belongingness to in-groups. They are willing to subordinate their personal goals to in-group goals, and they engage in competitions with out-groups to prove greater status of in-groups. Now let us try to understand how this kind of cultural variation is linked to different kinds of self. Generally, in the more complex, individualistic and loose cultures, people tend to rely on elements of private and individualistic self more as guides for their behavior. In complex cultures, a person is member of many groups. For example, the family group, the occupational group, the hobby groups, friend groups, religious groups, social media groups, neighborhood groups, etc. These groups are also likely to have conflictual norms. For example, family espouses a different kind of a lifestyle value, such as saving money, as compared to peer group, which may encourage spending. Now, this will mean that you may have to turn inwards to decide how you want to act. You will have to rely on personal values and thoughts in order to act. On the other hand, members of homogeneous and tight cultures, which require that group members behave according to group norms, are more likely to behave as per the standards and norms of significant others. For example, they are more likely to be collective than individualistic. In tight cultures, people tend to socialize their children by emphasizing the expectations of generalized others. Thus, public and collective selves are emphasized more in tight cultures as compared to private selves. In collectivistic cultures, children are socialized for obedience and respect for hierarchy. Again, selves are more likely to be collectivist here. In individualistic cultures, child-rearing patterns emphasize self-reliance, finding yourself, and actualization. This reinforces individualistic self. Identity is defined differently in individualistic and collectivist cultures. The kind of self that develops in a particular culture influences cognition, emotion, and motivation. For example, in the individualistic cultures like United States of America, studies have found that when participants are asked, "Is your self similar to others?" they usually judge the similarity to be low. This is as per a study done by Kitayama, Marcus, Tumala, Kurakova and Kato in 1990. This is because self-knowledge is more distinctive, elaborate and accessible to them as compared to knowledge about others. This pattern is somewhat different for Indian participants who are found to be judging the self to be more similar to others. Schroeder and Bourne in 1984 found that Indian participants tend to describe close acquaintances in terms of behaviors, what was done, when, how and with whom. In these person descriptions such as, and I quote, "He has no land to cultivate but likes to cultivate the land of others," or when a quarrel arises, he cannot resist the temptation of saying a word. It is the behavior that is the focus rather than the internal trait that underpins it. Since self is believed to be contingent on situations and contexts and is thus highly variable in collectivistic cultures, global inferences about persons are typically regarded as not meaningful or informative. In contrast, Americans are more likely to describe people they know well in terms of traits. Rather than saying, "Oh, he does not disclose secrets," Americans are more likely to say, "Well, he is discreet or principled." Rather than, "He is hesitant to give his money away," Americans may say, "He is tight or selfish." How does the self influences the emotions? Research has shown that negative emotions like anger are considered as highly dysfunctional in collectivistic cultures as it disrupts harmony in relationships, an important social goal in collectivistic cultures. Alan Rowland in 1988 reports that Asians are socialized by family to restrain their inner feelings of rage and anger, and particularly the overt expression of these feelings. In collectivistic cultures, pride in one's own accomplishments is inhibited because it involves focus on one's performance and abilities, which are not emphasized in such cultures. Additionally, there may be fears of attracting jealousy and evil eye, nazar lag jana, from others if one talks of one's accomplishments. Often, pride in such cultures is directed towards a collective of which self is a part. Thus, an Indian girl who tops a civil services exam is proud of bringing laurels to her family, coaching institute, educational institutions, and the city. These are the important groups which are sought to be enhanced by one's personal accomplishments. Correspondingly, guilt is also experienced as a consequence of hurting others psychologically or bringing a bad name to significant others. The ostracization of a member of family who is believed to have tarnished the reputation of the family members is an example of how guilty is communally punished in collectivist cultures. Now let us turn towards how motivation is influenced by a particular kind of self that we have. In individualistic cultures, independent selves are motivated to express their needs, views and abilities, and they resist the efforts to comply to undue social pressure. In collectivistic cultures, on the other hand, collective selves are motivated to be receptive to others and to adjust one's needs and demands to others. Achievement orientation, for example, is more socially oriented in such cultures. It is not as much a drive to feel a sense of accomplishment for one's own self, as much it is to meet the expectations of the significant others, the family members, to be a success and bring laurels to one's caste, religious, family group. In the West, there is a need to maintain consistency between attitudes and also the behaviors. However, in the Eastern cultures, need for consistency is not high, as personal opinions and beliefs are not significant drivers of behaviors. Iwao, 1988, gave respondents a series of scenarios and asked them to judge which responses would be appropriate for the persons described in the scenario. In one such scenario, the daughter brings home a person from another race. One of the possible responses given by the father in the scenario was, thought that he would never allow them to marry, but told them that he was in the favor of their marriage. This answer was rated as best by only 2% of Americans who have independent selves. Why? Because there was a discrepancy between what he thought and what he said. And this discrepancy is not acceptable or acknowledged by the Westerners. In sharp contrast, however, it was rated as best by 44% of the Japanese, Japan being an Eastern culture with more interdependent selves. Among the Americans, 48% thought it was the worst response, whereas only 7% of the Japanese rated it as the worst. Now we come to how do the socio-cultural changes affect the transformations of self. In understanding the links between culture and self, one must know that individualistic and collectivistic cultures, independent and interdependent selves are not mutually exclusive categories. Individualism and collectivism are two cultural ideologies emphasized as cultural ideals in the Euro-American and the Asian, African and Latin American contexts respectively. Triandis in 1994 emphasizes that the two cultures, collectivism and individualism, can coexist, and they are simply emphasized more or less in each culture. In fact, with increasing globalization, migration and intercultural mixing, these cultural ideologies have spread to geographical regions beyond their origins, resulting in coexistence and mixtures of self tendencies. Research on Indian self, for example, has shown that there is a coexistence of individualistic and collectivist tendencies. Individualism and collectivism can operate as reversible figure and ground. Similarly, in different contextual conditions, individualism and collectivism can be displayed. At workplace, the competitive ethos and the pressure to be self-driven and independent often makes one rely on individualistic tendencies. Whereas in the family contexts, the same person behaving in a differential manner, fulfilling emotional interdependencies and reciprocal obligations becomes the norm. So now I understand that you may have got a grasp over what is self, what is culture, how are the various dimensions of culture shape the different kinds of self, and in turn, how do the self impact the motivation, the cognition and the emotions of an individual. Thank you.